Hi, this session is on working with negative numbers and the Cartesian plane. Okay, so with negative numbers, we'll just recap on a few skills we have covered in class. Now, when we have two signs sitting together, for example, if I have two negatives that are sitting together, we know two negatives make a positive. If I have two positives sitting together, they are still positive. But when I have, for example, a positive and a negative, it becomes a negative. And the same if I had a negative first, then a positive, it equals a negative. This is something you have to recognize and remember. And a way to remember is, well, if they are the same, then it's always positive. And that just disappeared. Sorry. So if they're the same signs, we get, so here they're both the same, they are positive. So I guess in real life, when two people are the same, they get along, so it's positive. But when one is different and one is negative, you get your negatives. So a positive and a negative always make a negative. So it's pretty easy to remember. So let's look at some examples to explain what we just saw before. So if I look at example 1, I can see I have a negative here and a positive there. But they are not sitting together. So I can't say this negative and this positive make a negative. Whereas over here, they are in between these two numbers. And because they are sitting together, they become a negative. Okay, so you can see the difference. Because sometimes students get confused and think, well, there's a positive here and a negative here and a positive. How come there's no, that don't make a negative? So we can see why. So if we were to calculate this one here, you can use a number line, but you should be able to start doing it mentally. And we can see that if we are at a -2 plus 3, we will cross the 0 and end up at the positive side. But a way to do it quickly, when you have one number that's a negative and one number that's a positive, so in this case, I've got a -2 here and then a plus 3 there, positive 3. Just just subtract them. So 3 take away 2 normally is a 1. So my digit will be a 1. And then just do a check. 3 is a larger number and 3 is positive. So it's a positive 1. With number 2, because they're both sitting together, your first step is to change those two signs, in this case to a negative. So my next step, I will have 2 take away 3. Once again, just be careful. We can see that 1 is a positive. There's an invisible positive here. And 1's a negative. So once again, just go 3 take away 2, which is 1. But because the 3 is larger and it's got a negative next to it, it becomes a -1. Okay? And of course, when you have a small number, take away a bigger number, you know straight away the answer will have to be negative. Okay, so I want you to have a go with these two questions here and see how you go. So with questions like this, your first step is check your operations. I can see that I've got negatives and positives, and that's it. There's no, for example, division and multiplication. So this one, I'm just going to be adding and subtracting. Now, my first step is, before I try and calculate anything, any signs that you see sitting together, So any signs you see sitting together, you turn them into either a positive or a negative. So over here, I've got a positive and a negative. That makes a negative. 2 negatives here will make a positive. Okay? So that's important. Over here, I've got 1 positive or plus, so that just stays the way it is. Now, my next step is to write down what I have left. So 6. Now I can say subtract 8 plus 5 plus 2. Okay? And now this is something that's pretty straightforward. Just work from left to right. Please don't go 5 plus 2 first. Apply order of operations, or what we call BIDMAS. So if it helps, you can put brackets around the 6 and the 8 to emphasize that we are doing that first. Now be careful with positive and negatives. You ready? 6 take away 8. 6 is a smaller number. I know I will end up with a negative something. And I know that 6 is positive, so I've got a positive and a negative. So I always go, okay, what is 8 take away 6 normally? Well, that is just 2, and it's a negative 2. And I can see the 8 was the larger number, and it's got a negative there. All right, now write down the rest. So I've got negative 2 plus 5 plus 2. And now keep going. So my next step is to go negative 2 plus 5, working from left to right. So negative 2 plus 5, once again, one's a negative, one's a positive. So 5 take away 2 normally is just 3. And because 5 is larger and it's a plus, it's a positive 3. You can write positive 3 like that, but it's really invisible. So now I have 3 plus 2. What is 3 plus 2? That is just 5. So hopefully you had 5 for your answer. With the next question, once again, let's have a look and see. I can see I have brackets, so I have to work inside my brackets first. And in my brackets, I notice there are 2 negatives sitting together. So my first step is to change those into a positive. Okay? And now I'll just stop there and write down what I have left. So it's 16 take away, I still have my brackets, minus 2 plus 6 in the brackets. So I can see it nice and clearly. Now in my brackets, I have minus 2 or negative 2 plus 6. So I have negative 2 plus 6 in the brackets. So that will become, so 6 take away 2 normally is 4. And because 6 is larger and it's a positive, it's just a positive 4. So I'm left with, now my brackets are gone. So I'm left with 16. Don't forget to bring that take away there. Take away 4. And that one's pretty straightforward. My larger number is first, so I won't end up with a negative. 16 take away 4 is just 12. Okay, so now let's look at multiplying and dividing with negatives. And this is actually just as easy. What happens is when you multiply or divide and you have negatives or positives, they just come together. For example, if you look at question 1, I can see I've got a negative 2 times or multiply a negative 6. There are 2 negatives. So what happens is they actually come together and then you just multiply like normally. 2 times 6 is 12. And we know that 2 negatives sitting together make a positive. So our answer will just be positive 12. If we have a look at this one here, we are dividing. That's a negative 6, okay? And there's an invisible positive there. So negative 6 divided by positive 2. What happens is the negative and the positive come together, and 6 divided by 2 is just 3. Now these two become a negative, and we end up with negative 3. Okay? Now there is a trick that will help you to do this quickly, and that is, so the trick is when you are multiplying or dividing, just count the negatives. That is your very first step. So you can write that down as your first step. Okay? Step. When you have an even amount of negatives, the whole thing will be positive. If you have an odd amount of negatives, the whole thing will be negative. So an even amount of negatives, you get a positive answer. An odd amount, you get a negative answer. That is when you are only multiplying or dividing throughout the whole question. Okay, let's do some examples. Okay, so have a go at this first. Now what some people do, they work from left to right. They'll go, okay, a minus 2 times a minus 1 will give me a positive 2, and they keep going like that. It will work, but it will take you forever. So remember, first step, check your operations. I've got times everywhere, times. I'm multiplying everything, so I can do this trick. Count your negatives. 1, 2, 3, 4, and 5. The whole thing has 5 negatives. Now, I know 5 is an odd number, and therefore, if my answer has an odd amount of negatives, it'll be a negative. And now, once you've done that, forget about the negatives, just multiply your numbers. What is 2 times 1? That is 2. Then 2 times 1 is 2. 2 times 2 is 4. 4 times 1 is 4, and 4 times 1 is 4. So my answer is a negative 4. Okay, so have a go at this one. And we'll do it together. So our first step is check your operations. I have division here, division, and division. Okay, so because I'm dividing throughout the whole thing, I can do this trick. My next step is to count the negatives. I have a negative here, so 1, 2, and 3. 3 negatives is an odd number, therefore my answer will be negative. Your next step, now if this looks messy and confuses you, what you can do is just write down your numbers. So you know it's going to be a negative, and just so you can go, okay, I've got 8 divided by 2, divided by 2, divided by 1, if that makes it a bit more clearer. And remember, sometimes questions have brackets around the negative and the number, like that, to tell you that's dividing by a negative 2. So we can ignore those brackets. All right, so now I've got my negative out there saying the whole thing's negative. So 8 divided by 2 is simply 4. And you can do it step by step or keep going. 4 divided by 2 is 2. And 2 divided by 1 is just 2. So I left with a negative 2 as my final answer. The next thing we are going to look at are fractions and negatives, because this actually confuses students, especially at first and seeing it for the first time. So let's do an example. If I have, just say a negative 0.5, okay, it's a decimal number and it's a negative. If I asked you to write that as a fraction, well, we know 0.5 is the same as a half. Okay, it's the same thing. And we know this line here, the vinculum, is saying 1 divided by 2. So that actually means, we know it means division as well. Now, because it's a negative 0.5, this half in fraction form is also a negative. And you can see how it is sitting in the middle of the fraction. That's how we write a negative fraction. For example, if I had a negative 2/3, I will say negative 2/3. So it sort of sits in the middle. Now, sometimes you will see questions where the negative is not in the middle. For example, I can write this as a negative 1/2. That is still saying a negative half because there is one negative in the whole thing. Remember, an odd amount is negative, so it's still negative half. Or we can even have 1/2, okay? But we write our final answer as a negative half. The negative stays in the middle. But either all of them are correct, they are still a negative half. So if you ever see the negative on the top or the bottom or the middle, it's still the same thing. Now, if you have a look at our next question, we can see we are adding 2 fractions. We've got addition in the middle. But you notice that the first one is a negative 3/4. I've got a negative just sitting here. Now, to work out fractions when you've got negatives and positives, you do the exact same thing. And what I mean is, to add or subtract negatives, we have to have the same denominators. And what we do to the bottom, we must do to the top. So I know I can turn my 2 into a 4. So this is using our fraction skills. Just go times by 2, times by 2. And I'll be left with, I still have a negative 3/4 there. So plus 2 over 2. So I sort of picked a bad example, but 2 over 4. Sorry, it's a good example. All right, so I've got 2 over 4 now, and now I can add these 2 fractions. But this is where you have to be a bit careful, and this is where students get confused. They see this negative here in the middle, sitting in the middle, and they don't know what to do with it. So when we're adding and subtracting negatives, I want you to include this step. And that is, I want you to write the fraction as one fraction. So the denominator is 4. So just write it once as 4. And then on top, what happens is that negative, you can say, belongs to the 3. It goes on top. So I have a negative 3 plus 2. And I can see that a lot more clearly, what I have to do. So when you have a negative sitting in the middle and you want to add or subtract fractions, that negative belongs to the top number because we are adding or subtracting the numerators. And this step here helps us to see that a bit more clearly, what's actually happening. So now, what is a negative 3 plus 2? Using our fraction skills, well, one's a negative, one's a positive. So I know 3 take away 2 is 1, and it will be a negative 1 because 3 is larger and it is negative. Okay. Now, that's my final answer. My answer is a negative quarter. I've got a negative there, and there's one negative in the whole thing, so it's a negative. But to write it a bit neater and more, and the final answer, we put the negative in the middle and say a negative quarter, just like that. But if you stop there, that is still correct. But the proper way is to just put it in the middle, it's still saying the whole thing is negative. Okay, so I want you to have a go at this one first, and see how you go. So with this one, we have to be using our fraction skills. For example, I can see I have a mixed fraction. So I will be turning this mixed fraction into an improper by multiplying and adding. The other thing I notice is that we actually have two negatives sitting together. Because they are sitting together, they will become a positive. That's another step I will do first. So let's do those two steps. Don't forget the negative is sitting out there. We haven't dealt with that one yet. So I have a minus. I'll turn my mixed fraction into improper. 3 times 2 is 6. And 6 plus 1 is 7. So 7 over 3. This became a plus. So plus 5 over 6. Okay, so they were my first two steps. Turn two negatives into a positive, and then turn my mixed fraction into improper. And now we just keep using our fraction skills. Now, if you're not confident with your fraction skills, you need to make sure you go back and practice and watch other lessons. But hopefully this is helping you. So now when we add fractions, we have to have, or subtract, we have to have the same denominator. So I know my 3 and 6 are different, and I can turn my 3 into a 6 by multiplying it by 2. So this side here can stay the same. Okay, so I am now left with a negative, and then 7 times 2 is 14 over 6 plus 5 over 6. Now that I have the same denominators, I am going to write them under the same denominator, which is 6. And on top, okay, to see it more clearly, I have a negative 14 plus 5. Okay, remember that negative goes on the top, so we're going to work it out that way. So it becomes a negative 14. And now, use your negative number skills. A negative 14 plus 5. Well, just normally, what is 14 take away 5? 14 take away 5 is just 9. And then do our check. 14 is larger, and it's a negative. So I have a negative 9 on top. Now, my answer is going to be a negative, so I will have a negative sitting in the middle. But don't stop there. We have to keep using our fraction skills. We have 9 on top and 6 on the bottom. I know I can simplify this if I divide them both by 3. That will be my next step. So 9 divided by 3 is just 3, and 6 divided by 3 is just 2. So it's a negative 3 over 2. And then my final step is turn it back into a mixed fraction. So it's going to be a negative, and then I have 3 over 2. Well, that will equal 2 into 3 goes once, remainder 1 over 2. So 1.5. So hopefully you had that as your answer. A negative 1.5. Okay, now looking at our next question, we notice we have fractions, but what are the operations in the middle? We have multiplication here and multiplication there. So I am multiplying all these fractions together. And I notice that some of them are negative. Here I have a negative 14 over 2. Here I have a negative 2/3. Sometimes the questions will have brackets like that. So don't get confused. The brackets can be invisible. So I'll get rid of those because the question didn't have it. So my first step is, when multiplying fractions like this, we know we simplify before we multiply. But now that we have negatives, our first step is to work out, is the whole thing going to be a negative or a positive? So because we are multiplying everything, just count the negatives. I have 1 and 2. I see 2 negatives in the whole thing, which means 2 is even. It's an even number. So therefore, my answer is going to be positive. So that's done. So I can forget about these negatives. I've taken care of those. So imagine they weren't there. Okay, and now let's simplify using our fraction skills. So I've got 2 up here, a 2 down there. Remember, simplify anything from top and bottom. I have a 3 and 3, they're the same. They all become 1 because we're dividing by the same number. Here I've got a 7 and up here I've got a 14 left. Well, I know 7, I can go 7 divided by 7, which is 1, and 14 divided by 7 is just 2. Okay, so I have now 1 times 1 times 2, which is just 2 on top. Multiply the bottom numbers together. So 1 times 1 is just 1. So my answer is just a positive 2. And the positive and the 1 can be invisible. Okay, if you have a look at this question here, you notice that we are check our operations first. We are multiplying here and we are dividing here. And I've got some negatives. So for example, this is saying 3 over 7 divided by a negative 1/7, not divided by and subtract, okay? All right, so my first step is, because I'm multiplying and dividing, I can still do that first step, and that is count your negatives. So I've got a negative here and a negative there. 2 negatives in the whole thing. My answer is going to be a positive. So now I can ignore my negatives. I've taken care of those. And now just use your fraction skills. We work from left to right, and I've got multiplication here. In this case, I also have a division here, and I'm going to have to turn that into times by swapping or flipping for 1 over 7. But let's just, we can actually do that first. Flip the 1 over 7. So I have 2 over 5 times 3 over 7. Turn this into times by flipping my 1 over 7. So I end up with 7 over 1. Okay. Now that I've done that, because I'm multiplying everything, I don't have to really work from left to right. I can just simplify before I multiply. Okay, so I've got a 7 down here and a 7 up there. They cancel out. Now there's nothing else that I can simplify. 2 and 5 I can't simplify. 5 and 3 I can't simplify. So multiply across. 2 times 3 is 6. 6 times 1 is just 6 over. And then 5 times 1 is just 5. Sorry. So I'm left with 6 over 5. And our final step is to write it as a mixed fraction. 5 into 6 goes once. Remainder 1 over 5. And it was a positive. Okay, if you have a look at our next section, we are looking at brackets and negatives. Now, this can be very confusing at first, and a lot of students get this wrong. So it's important we go through this properly. Now, when we have a bracket here, you notice these brackets, there's a power 2 out there. And here we've got a power 3. Now, this is very important. We can't just get rid of the brackets now. They have to be there because of those powers. Now, looking at the first one, look inside the brackets. We have a negative 3, okay? That's really important. A negative 3. And they are both in the bracket, which means they are both going to be squared. So that little 2 will hit the 3, just say. It will also hit and include the negative. It's really important. So now what we end up with is I am saying I have a negative times a negative. So I have 2 negatives, and then that 2 is saying 3 squared, just like that. That's what it's saying. So it's saying 3 times 3. And 3 times 3 is just 9. So when I have 2 negatives sitting together, it becomes a positive. So my answer for that one is a positive 9. Let's try the next one and see how we go. If you have a look, this time, look inside your brackets. I have a negative and a 3, and there's a power 3 out there. So that is saying now 3 negatives, or a negative times a negative times a negative. And here I am saying 3 to the power of 3. Or I am saying 3 times 3 times 3, 3 times. Another way of writing it is like this. If you want to do it the long way, what you can do is you just go, okay, I have a minus 3 times a minus 3 times a minus 3. So it's saying minus 3 times minus 3 times minus 3, 3 times. That might be a better way to look at it if the first way confused you. And now let's just multiply what we have. How many negatives in the whole thing? I've got 1, 2, and 3. So 3 negatives makes a negative because it's odd. And then 3 times 3 is 9. 9 times 3 is 27. So my answer for that one is a negative 27. Okay, so there's 2 ways you can look at it. You can sort of say, okay, that 2 is saying 2 negatives, and then 3 times 2, which is 9, or write it out the long way if it helps. Let's do another example. Okay, have a look at this one. Maybe you can start seeing what's happening with our negatives. If you see an even number out here, then that means there's going to be an even amount of negatives. So the answer, as a shortcut, is going to be positive. But let's do it the long way. I have minus 2 times minus 2 times minus 2 times minus 2. 4 times. Okay, so 1, 2, 3, 4. And then 4 negatives, yes, makes a positive. And then that is just saying 2 to the power of 4. So I have 2 times 2 is 4, times 2 is 8, times 2 is 16. So my answer became a positive 16. Now, if you have a look at our next example, be very careful. What do you notice is missing in this one compared to the others? We have no brackets. And that's very important to notice, because that 3 now only belongs to the 2, not the negatives. Not the negative. So that is just saying in the whole thing, there is just 1 negative. That hasn't changed. And then it is saying 2 times 2 times 2, which is 2 to the power of 3. And 2 to the power of 3, well, 2 times 2 is 4, times 2 is 8. So you should have had a negative 8 for that one. Okay? So it's very important. If there are no brackets, the negative is not included. If I had brackets like the other ones, imagine the brackets are giving them both a hug. They are both included in the hug. So that would say, okay, 3 negatives, so I would have had a minus 2 times a minus 2 times a minus 2. But I did not have that. Okay, so this will be our last question. We won't be doing the Cartesian plane. We'll do it in class because the lesson's going for too long now. Okay, so with this one, have a go first. Don't give up. Remember, it's actually not as hard as you think. All right, so with this one, we notice we have brackets here. And brackets usually come first. And the brackets have to be there. There's a power 3 sitting outside the brackets. And that is saying the whole thing is being multiplied with itself 3 times. So 3 negatives and then 2 times 2 times 2. So if you can do it mentally, you do that. Let's show some working out. So for this one here, I actually have a minus 2. I'll do it. I can do it down here. So I've got minus 2 times minus 2 times minus 2. I'll leave them in brackets. Take away 3 over 2. So I haven't dealt with the 3 to the power of 2. Sorry, take away 3 to the power of 2. So now, in here, I'm going to have 3 negatives. 1, 2, 3 make a negative. Then 2 times 2 times 2. 2 times 2 is 4, times 2 is 8. And don't forget to write down the minus 3 to the power of 2, or 3 squared. Okay, so that's what I am left with. Now, my next step with order of operations is I have to take care of that power. I've got 3 to the power of 2. There are no brackets, so that negative over here, or that takeaway, is not included. So what is 3 to the power of 2 normally? Well, 3 times 3 is 9. So I'm left with negative 8, takeaway, 9. Okay? And now my final step is to use my negative number skills. When we see a negative number take away another number, so a negative 8, and that's sort of like a negative 9, we simply add them. 8 plus 9 is 17. And because they're both negative, the whole thing is negative. We keep going down the negative end. Okay, so hopefully this made a bit of sense. I'll give you a couple of questions to just practice with, and then I'll check it in class tomorrow. Okay, so try these 2 questions for some more homework, and have a go with the second one. Remember, use order of operations, and in the brackets, you know how to work that out now. Thank you.